Kind of my main companion and my main protagonist of the story today is rapeseed, which is a plant that I can imagine many of you know. As for Ukrainian-speaking audience, it's raps or rypak. For the English-speaking audience, you may know it primarily as rapeseed. It's also known as canola, which just stands for Canadian oil. It's also known as colza, brassicanapus. It goes by many, many names. And I'm always, when I'm giving these talks, I'm very curious how many people in the room have actually seen rapeseed, just so that I know how many people are familiar with the creature. Okay, mainly, most people. Good, nice. Just as it goes by many names, it also goes, or it's entangled in many different stories or histories. And this is part of my broader research on rapeseed, on the monocultures in Ukraine, and I've pulled out some of these stories today. I could easily spend half an hour talking about each. I was trying to decide whether I go kind of narrow and deep into a few, but considering that we have a very interdisciplinary audience today, I decided to hop through many of them. So please do grab me if you're curious about some of them, and I rush through it too quickly. But the reason that I find rapeseed a fascinating crop is that I feel that it allows to see the continuity of both imperial, socialist, and capitalist temporalities all enmeshed in Ukraine's landscapes. This work also holds personal significance for me because, as Johnny has mentioned, I'm from Kropivnitsky, earlier known as Kirovohrad, which is in central Ukraine, which is a region where a lot of these monocultures are thriving, for better or for worse. And I'm very interested in challenging also regional histories and the way we tell regional histories. For central Ukraine, the narratives mainly revolve around productive nature or productive land, hardworking people, and I'm trying to push against that and see what else can we see when we look at the landscape. So I'm gonna chat through this today. So the plant, first, it's you may know this by probably fields of yellow stretching into the horizon. That's what it kind of is mainly represented as. It has a very, very distinct yellow flower, uniformly 4 petals. It's all quite, uniform creature. In terms of its relation to other members of its vegetal family, it's part of the cabbage or mustard family of the plants. And if you ever find yourself in the middle of a rapeseed field, which you never know where life might take you, I did find myself in the middle of a rapeseed field when I was doing field work for this work, and it has a very intense cabbage smell. It's like as if you are in a cabbage jungle. Rapeseed is primarily known as a cooking oil. It's only topped by soy oil and palm oil, so you can see it in the supermarket shelves labeled as canola oil mainly, but also you can find it in the most bizarre places. It's in lubricants, it's an important oil for carrier drugs, it's used in the production of rubbish bags, it's in bread wraps, it's just kind of all sorts of places. For a long time, it's been used actually as industrial oil to grease the parts of the ships that went into outer seas in the north, because it's got low freezing point, and that means it's good for those things. So I would ask you to hold that bit of how rapeseed has been folded into the industrial story in your mind, because the industrial story is a loop here, and we're going to come back to that one. So locating it in terms of its relation to other agricultural crops, Ukraine, it's probably not going to be a surprise for most of you, has one of the highest percentage of arable land in the world. It's 70% of the entire country, and Ukraine is huge, so it's really vast amounts of land we're talking about. And it's, together with a few other grains and oil crops, it forms top 5 crops by area planted in Ukraine. This is just the visual that I made based on the open source data from the Statistical Yearbook on Agriculture of Ukraine. So this, of course, it's not geographical representation, it's just for scale so that we see. So we have sunflower and winter wheat, absolute leaders there, covering nearly 7 million hectares. Then we have maize, 5.5 million. Then comes rapeseed at 1 to 1.5. And then we have potato, but year to year changes, it's often soybeans. Numbers never convey the full story, obviously, and I'm usually not hugely into numbers, but there is something important to pay attention to here, because what these numbers offer us is a reckoning with the scale. We have 5 crops that altogether occupy about 40% of the entire country. So when Johnny was introducing this seminar in the morning, he was talking about the different kind of steppes and forests and those kind of ecosystems that we have. And that's true, we have some of those, but we have to understand that, yeah, it's nearly half of the country is 5 crops, and most of these are export crops. Rapeseed in this context is very interesting, not so much because of so you can see it's not the hugest in terms of the area it occupies, but there's a few different things about it that I find fascinating. That in the past 20 years, its production has grew dramatically in Ukraine. It increased by 613%. It's not just the area in terms of the scale, the size that it occupies, but it also the yields and the harvests have increased, so how much the farmers were able to gather from 1 square kilometer of the land. But what's perhaps key here is this number over here, that 90 to 95% of this crop of the 1.5 million of the land that it covers goes for export. And all of these 5 crops, except potato there, they are export crops, but rapeseed's export percentage is significantly higher. So you would have with others 50, 60, 70, so there is some internal and external market that it goes to, but rapeseed is really primarily for export. Oh yeah, and I had to say that also this is the screenshot from One Soil, which is the satellite agricultural land mapping platform. So when we think about Ukrainian landscapes, actually this is the kind of patch that we are talking about. All of these colors stand for some kind of crops. The gray in the middle there is the city, but all of that is, yeah, plotted in this kind of hectic way, agricultural land. The other part of the story, which is a very central and one of the biggest driver and motivation for me behind this work, is the fuel story. The reason behind this growing scale of production of rapeseed in Ukraine is high and consistent demand from the European Union for Ukraine's rapeseed. The political ecologist Christina Plank has brilliant, like very, very deep research on this. This one, if you're curious, highly, highly recommend. Some of it goes for animal feed, some of it goes for oil, but primarily Ukrainian rapeseed goes for the production of biodiesel. And because we don't have a special audience here, maybe I'll just clarify that some crops do have that ability to be converted into biofuel or agrofuel, where you can make fuel out of the crop by pressing these seeds. And the reason for that steep curve that goes up, which is also open source data that I took from the same publication as before, is that in 2003, you can quite clearly see this year over here is the year when EU has adopted the directive on biofuels, which said that all of the member states should include X amount of, it was 5.5, something like that, of biofuels to conventional fuels. This was EU's technocratic attempt to address the climate crisis, to reduce emissions. The policy itself had extremely turbulent journey. EU went eventually from promoting biofuel to cancelling them, following pressure from the environmental groups who said, hey, EU, maybe this is a terrible idea to convert vast amounts of fields into monoculture plantation to fuel your green energy transition. So it took lots of years. EU eventually kind of modified it, changed it. But what it did achieve, it did not achieve fossil fuel emission reductions, that was very clear, but what it did achieve is creating a biofuel market into which Ukraine has been, folded into with its production. The important part of the story here is on the toxicity that is connected to this scale of the production that we are talking about. So this is a screenshot from Ecodozor, which is a platform who is documenting the hits, the infrastructure that Russia hits. And in Ukraine, there are nearly 30,000 of all sorts of these facilities. 3,000 of them store highly toxic agricultural chemicals. Most of these allocated in the area of the formerly steppe, or now converted agricultural fields, in the active war zone, or in the areas occupied by Russia. So it's a very complicated story there, with basically rapeseed needing, it's maybe a common kind of knowledge, but to point out that all of this scale of agriculture is reliant on high amounts of agrochemicals, fertilizers and pesticides as well. I've been looking specifically, working with like also databases on agrochemicals, and out of the 3,000 and a half legal agrochemicals in Ukraine, nearly 700 are specifically for rapeseed. A number of these are banned in the EU chemicals because they've been proven to cause cancer, etc. Yeah, long and devastating story there, really. But the point here is that when we read the news that Russia attacked another agricultural facility, and mainly it's been reported through the grain has been lost, which is true, but what Russia also hits is agricultural storage facilities with these chemicals, thereby turning Ukraine's agricultural storage facilities into their chemical weapons, because all of this leaks into the environment and will remain poisonous for decades and decades to come. So this is just kind of, to keep that perspective that this did not emerge overnight. This kind of the scale of ecocide that we're talking about has these broader histories. And of course, when we're talking about the crop like rapeseed being primarily an export crop, we're also talking about some groups within Ukrainian society and internationally as well who are benefiting from the scale of this production, and therefore also from the arrangement of the landscapes in Ukraine. It perhaps would be a convenient thing to point to the somewhere else externally from Ukraine to say, well, they're to blame, they're causing this, they do the damage. But also internally there's massive issues that we have. So what I'm talking about is the that it's not just EU climate policy obviously driving these levels of productions, but Ukraine's very own agricultural oligarchs, but also international firms as well. When we look at the rapeseed specifically, year to year, and even with the beginning of the full-scale war, we have these companies reporting yet another year of record profits, of record exports. That's not something you hear much on the news, but if you go a little bit into this agricultural data, it's all there. The top three exporters of rapeseed are ADM, Cargill, and Glencore. The first two are the subsidiaries of the American firms, and the last one is Swiss, and the rest include a mix of also foreign companies, but also Ukrainian large agricultural holdings like Nibelon, Kovco, MHP, Mironitsky, Хлібопродукт, and others. Many of them actually own their own port infrastructure as well to make the transportation of the grains easier. And there's another layer to think about how this trade is made possible at the scale and at the level of the what's happening in Ukraine politically. So I don't know how many of you are following this, but in a couple of years ago, in 2020, Zelensky has pushed through and passed the land reform, which basically made the land market legal. So not only we have the ongoing war happening, but we have like a full-scale land market that opened, that has been paused for a little bit, but then proceeded. So we have, a very complicated story with who is able now to buy Ukrainian land, at what scale, and then who can make what kind of decisions on it. And it's of course important to pay attention to this part of the story because there is the devastating harms that we've talked about in the morning and the losses that are associated with the war, but it's a very uncomfortable story that it also means profits for a lot of people, and it's a very particular class story here as well because it's a I'm going to talk about this later. I'm going to talk about too much in one slide. The other kind of dimension to this story is trying to trace what happens when a plant or a whole landscape is turned into a commodity or fetish in materialist terms. And what I'm interested here is in the roots of how come some landscapes are turned into the entire, into the monoculture fields that serve primarily export goals. And I have been working last year a lot with archives. I'm not a historian, not yet anyway, but I've discovered the joy of working with, getting deep into the numbers that the archives can offer you and the stories in there. And I found records for my Kropyvnytsky Oblast, or it was called something else at the time, back from 1886, from the land surveyors at the time, describing that most of the crops here are grown for export production already. So this is really nothing new, and rapeseed is not the only crop, of course, that can help us see that story. Wheat was also grown primarily for export at the time, but the scale of it was, of course, quite different. And what we see with this commodity fetishizing the landscape, that it also stretches into the modern day. We touched a little bit on the recovery policies in the morning, but when we look specifically at what is being presented by the agriculture, what is it called? Sorry, let me just get it right here. New Agrarian Policy Working Group, which is part of the National Research Council, which is the main representative body that goes to the conferences in London, in Berlin, and sits down with investors to ask for money for the recovery. When you look at their plans, because some of them are public at least, and you can look at them, it's a lot of it is export-oriented facilities. One of them, for example, was the export-oriented food factory asking for $15 billion US dollars for reconstruction money. So we have to also understand that reconstruction is we have to see class in this reconstruction and whose voices are represented and whose aren't. And those kind of projects often go against what the organizations like Ukraine's Association for Peasant Farmers are calling for. It's a very, very different nature of proposals and visions that we have here. Oh yeah, and I have to explain this line over here because I ended up also looking at, it's a whole genre of vlogs on YouTube with rapeseed seed distributors recording and advertising their products, which is the seeds that they sell to the farmers. And I ended up caught up in the namings of them, looking, so many of them have this namings of like temptation or Beatrix or dominatrix. And I said, what is going on here? What fantasy is this feeding, and why? I do not have answers. This is what's going on there. The habitat is another key part of the story, because all of this is not just abstract political economy, it's not just abstractions of power, value, geopolitics. It is that too, but it's also it is living beings that are ultimately folded or excluded from this process. And that's why I found also lots of fascinating materials in the archives, again going back and looking what has happened in the 1880s and 1890s, because that was the time when this large-scale agriculture was only emerging, when Ukraine was still the periphery of the Russian Empire. And the two creatures that I was looking at was first the groundhog, and this is just one of the photographs of one of the dela, what's the kind of the files in the archive. And there is a correspondence between some of the Kropyvnytsky state authorities and the Khersonska gubernia, because Kropyvnytsky was part of the Khersonska gubernia at the time, on the extermination of groundhogs. And I have to say, I did not go into the archive with a mission to find a correspondence on the extermination of the groundhogs, but I could not resist. I had to look. And what I found was, this is a very bizarre adventure, but this is where rapeseed gets you sometimes. They received orders as to how many ground squirrels they had to exterminate, and when we're talking about the time, so this was the time before pesticides were invented, at the scale at least that we know them today, and they were killed by their reports then following this correspondence in one year they killed 4 million of them, in another 5 million, and they kept not succeeding in killing enough groundhogs. And the whole conversation is about that. And the whole reason they had to exterminate them was because they were not meeting the targets for exports again. So it's who got pushed out in the story there. I also looked at the land lease agreements, hoping to find some kind of demands to take care of the land in the long run when the land started being leased in the long term. But out of they're all quite standardized. Out of those 10 points that they include, mainly it's all about how you have to pay money to the landowner, what happens if you don't pay the money. The only environmental thing within that story is how many paws of the ground squirrels they had to bring to the local administration as a proof that they've killed enough of them. And the other creature also considered as the enemy at the time was the hamster. And this is the quote that I just translated by myself from the archives that was in Russian that I found quite fascinating, saying that perhaps more terrifying than a ground squirrel today is a more and more common enemy of a land worker, hamster. This is the picture that I took in the Lviv Natural History Museum. It's quite big, actually. Like it's not a tiny hamster that we are all used to. I suspect they deliberately made it a bit more terrifying than this creature actually was, so that you could imagine. Yeah, of course. Doesn't he look like an enemy? Of course he does. Kind of this language around the enemy of the land worker, of the landowner sometimes, we can see how that language then morphed into the enemy of the people in the Soviet times and kind of who was declared the enemy. So this was the time before the language of pests has emerged. Enemies of land workers were also frogs, bugs, all sorts of other creatures who stood in the way of the spread of this mass agriculture. And when you look at some of the promotion material, corporate reports, which I find fascinating from language perspective also to analyze, a lot of these rapeseed producers would tell you what a great place a rapeseed field is for creating an ecosystem. I had a slide earlier that said rapeseed is a habitat, alongside rapeseed is a growth, whatever that means. And the common arguments that you could hear amongst Ukrainian politicians and farmers as well is that it's very good for the bees because bees love it and they make good honey from it, which is it's true partially. Bees like rapeseed as much as they do other plants, but it's only true until these bees die en masse being poisoned by these very pesticides that we were talking about. And each year in May, June, the time when rapeseed blooms, and also the time when farmers spray these pesticides, it's very clear on these agricultural portals in Ukraine. On May, there's reports from these farmers always talking about, another year of the spraying began, and so began the bee death, as if it's a direct causality. But that is what is happening, unfortunately. If we think back to this slide that I showed at the beginning with the 5 crops that occupy 40% of Ukrainians' land, there is also a simplification story here. The ecologists have long been alarmed and have been very vocal about the state of the soils and the state of the land in Ukraine, calling it catastrophic. That's not an exaggeration. There is lots of ecological data to support that, sadly. And I stumbled upon I spent a lot of time thinking about this kind of simplicity, complexity, what is this monoculture, what is mono and what is poly in this whole story, basically. I don't have time to explain this into too much detail now, but the concept of simplicity or simplification I found striking in Ukrainian legislation. I've been looking at so this is the quote here from the Ukrainian main law on land protection, called on land protection, literally, from 2003, and it defines, I'm just going to translate into English a part of it, it defines degradation of the soil as the natural or anthropogenic simplification of the landscape. It unfortunately does not offer any more details anywhere else on what the simplification is, but I think it's a very productive and generative concept to think with, whose lives and what landscapes are simplified in this process. It's also a concept that I then later found in the works of the anthropologist Anna Tsing, who also talks about modular simplifications as a way to describe what the scale of agriculture is doing to the lives within those landscapes. This is just a graph that I also made trying to visualize. So this is not even comparing like ecological to agricultural landscapes. It's thinking about the simplification that happens within agricultural landscapes themselves. So this is the kind of the 2000 column here. You can see the kind of crops that were grown, and jump back to 2021, you have much fewer crops also. So it's also the range of these crops is getting narrower and simpler. And when you look at what kind of crops are going out, it's the traditional crops like buckwheat for Ukraine, for example. And it's the struggle that a lot of people, indigenous people in South America can relate to, whose also native traditional crops have been displaced by whatever the market asked for. This is my last point, actually. When we talked about a lot the destruction that Russia is bringing in Ukraine, and it's truly horrendous, and it is unprecedented, and should not be underestimated. But when we look at the calls for recovery, how are we even to conceptualize what like a better, greener, different, more socially climate just future looks like? Some of the calls go a call for the pre-war situation, but it wasn't great. We already know that it was massively, severely degraded land. So that's not really a good enough before point to go back to. Another before point that is often evoked is before Bolsheviki, before the revolution, because that's when you look at the discourse around the land in Ukraine and the way that the land reform was positioned by Zelensky's government, it was very much seen or communicated as fixing the centuries of historic injustice, that Bolsheviki stole this land and we have returned it to the people. What people they are returning it to is a separate question. We can discuss this later on. But this kind of the black box of the pre-Bolsheviki Ukraine as part of the Soviet Empire, that's really not part of the story. But as kind of, as I hopefully have shown with some of this archival work, that the pre-Bolsheviki time, it's also not a place to search for the utopia there. It was also the time when the landscapes were valued primarily for their commodity production function. So if we think back to the rapeseed and how it was once used as the industrial lubricant to feed and to smooth really the industrialization by making sure all the parts in the ships were functioning smoother, it's quite ironic that a century later this very same crop is basically drafted to serve another story of industrialization, except this time it's agricultural and it's green, and it's called to fix the mistakes of the previous industrialization mistakes in attempts to reduce the fossil fuels. It did not become, obviously, the savior crop that some of the European politicians and agricultural businessmen had imagined it to be. It got tangled into the further commodification and simplifications of the land to accommodate the production of commodities and not webs of life. At the global scale, I suppose what I'm thinking about here is that I would love us to have more of these kind of interdisciplinary conversations where we think what it means when we see places like Ukraine, places like different African countries, like in the South Americas, that are becoming frontiers for Europeans or West green transitions, whose landscapes are being folded into this, at whose cost all of this is being produced, and how rapeseed specifically is becoming EU's or turning Ukraine's landscapes into EU's frontiers for technocratic, eco-modernist, capitalist green transition visions. And what I'm asking myself today in relation to Ukraine's specifically more maybe internal discussion, and that's the question that I would like to discuss more and leave us with is what if we imagine this scale of agricultural production as part of our dark heritage, imperial heritage, with a capitalist spin on it? What then, with that kind of understanding, would decolonization look like at the scale of a landscape? Thank you.